Charles Bronson names the 7 actors he respects most. Charles Bronson is born, but not in Hollywood, not in comfort, and definitely not in the kind of world that creates movie stars. He came into this world as Charles Dennis Bukinski on November 3, 1921, in the coal country of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania. He was the 11th of 15 children, a boy growing up in a house where hunger wasn't an exception. It was a routine. His father was a Lithuanian immigrant, a coal miner who spent his days underground and his nights wondering how to feed his kids. When Bronson was still a child, his father died. That meant one thing: he had to grow up overnight. By the time most kids were playing baseball, Bronson was deep underground, covered in coal dust, shoveling for survival. He later said he made $1 a day, and half of that went straight to his family. That world of grit, silence, and struggle shaped him more than any acting class ever could. He learned early that men who talk too much usually have the least to say. So Bronson spoke little and worked harder than anyone around him. Then came World War II. He enlisted, became an aerial gunner, and flew 25 combat missions over the Pacific. Every flight was a gamble with death, and he came home decorated but haunted. He'd seen men vanish midair, heard engines die in silence, and when he finally set foot back on American soil, something inside him had changed forever. The boy from the mines had become a man of steel. No drama, no ego, just purpose. And that toughness, that real toughness, is what he carried with him when he stepped into Hollywood, a place where everyone acted tough, but few actually were. And when you understand that kind of beginning, you start to see why Bronson respected only a handful of men. Because to earn his respect, you had to live through fire, not fame. When Bronson arrived in Hollywood, he didn't look like the kind of man casting directors wanted. Too rough, too quiet, too real. But that was his advantage. While others were trying to charm their way to the top, Bronson walked into rooms like a man who'd already seen the worst the world could offer, and survived it. He wasn't pretending to be tough. He was tough. He studied acting through the GI Bill at the Pasadena Playhouse, but even then, his instructors noticed something different. He didn't perform, he became. In his early years, he took whatever roles he could get: nameless soldiers, faceless villains, uncredited henchmen. Movies like House of Wax, 1953, and Apache, 1954, gave him scraps of screen time. But even then, audiences noticed him. A glance, a silence, a look that said everything without a word. He wasn't the hero, but you couldn't look away. Hollywood at first didn't know what to make of him. They were obsessed with perfect smiles and clean faces. Bronson had neither. He was rough-hewn, scarred, and unpolished, like a man carved out of stone. But slowly, that became his brand. Then came The Magnificent Seven, 1960. For the first time, he wasn't just another background tough guy. He was Bernardo O'Reilly, the quiet mercenary with a conscience. And when he helped a group of poor villagers defend their homes, audiences saw it, the humanity behind the hardness. 2 years later, The Great Escape sealed his legend. As Danny the Tunnel King, Bronson brought real fear to the role. And it wasn't acting. Bronson himself suffered from claustrophobia, just like his character. He used that fear, turned it into authenticity. When he crawled through those dark tunnels, sweating, panicked, it was real. Europe loved him for it. In France, Italy, and Germany, audiences saw him as something new. The anti-star, the man who didn't need glamour to dominate a screen. They called him L'homme du silence, the man of silence. And then came 1968, Once Upon a Time in the West. The harmonica, the stare, the dust. Bronson didn't have to move, didn't have to speak. He simply existed, and every other actor faded away. Sergio Leone, the film's director, later said, "He was like a block of granite, but you could feel the fire inside." That was Bronson's magic, a stillness that burned. By the 1970s, he had conquered both sides of the Atlantic. Then Death Wish happened. The story of a man pushed to his limits, taking justice into his own hands. It wasn't just a role. It was a reflection of every hardship he'd endured. For audiences struggling with crime, chaos, and fear, Bronson became a symbol. The man who wouldn't back down. But while fans saw the legend, Bronson was watching quietly. always studying others. He respected actors who reminded him of truth, men who'd lived, not just performed. And one day, when a journalist asked him, "Who are the actors you respect the most?" Bronson gave a list that told the world everything about who he really was. Because the first name he mentioned wasn't a superstar, it was a soldier. When the interviewer asked Bronson, "Who do you respect the most?" he didn't blink, didn't think, didn't hesitate. He said one name, Lee Marvin. Bronson leaned back in his chair and said, "Lee was a soldier, plain and simple. He didn't play tough, he was tough. And that wasn't Hollywood talk, that was real." Lee Marvin had fought in World War II, just like Bronson. He took a bullet in the back during the Battle of Saipan and nearly died. That scar followed him everywhere, even on camera. Bronson said he carried the war with him. You could see it in his eyes. When Marvin stepped onto a set, everyone went quiet, not out of fear, but respect. Because he didn't act like a man who'd seen things. He was that man. That's what Bronson respected most. Truth, not method acting, not fancy technique. Real scars, real stories, real weight. Marvin had that gravity. When they filmed The Dirty Dozen together, the chemistry was electric. Two men cut from the same stone. Soldiers turned actors, carrying ghosts behind their eyes. There was no ego, no small talk. They didn't need it. One nod between them said more than a page of dialogue, but the next name Bronson mentioned, that one came with tension. Steve McQueen. If Lee Marvin was a brother in arms, Steve McQueen was a rival in battle. They met on the set of The Great Escape, and from day one, the air between them crackled. McQueen, the rising star, the king of cool. Bronson, the quiet outsider with a stare that could kill. The story goes that McQueen was jealous. Every time Bronson stepped into a frame, McQueen's effortless swagger didn't seem so effortless anymore. Bronson had something no one could fake, real danger. But here's what makes it fascinating. Bronson never trashed McQueen. He respected him. Deeply. Steve had that hunger in his eyes, he said. He fought for every role like it was his last. And that's what Bronson admired. That fire. That desperation to be great. The two men were different breeds of alpha. McQueen, the restless rebel chasing fame, and Bronson, the silent warrior who didn't care about fame at all. But somehow they pushed each other to be better. Their rivalry became the fuel behind their best performances. It was competition, but it was also code. Two lone wolves circling the same territory, never saying a word, but always aware of the other's strength. In a world full of soft talkers and fakes, Bronson found in Marvin and McQueen something he could respect: honesty, courage, and fight. But his admiration didn't stop with men who lived rough or fought wars. The next names on his list, Clint Eastwood and James Coburn, revealed a side of Bronson most people never saw: his respect for control, intelligence, and silence as power. When Charles Bronson named the next man he respected, it wasn't a fellow tough guy or silent cowboy. It was Gregory Peck. That surprised people, because Peck was the opposite of Bronson in almost every way: tall, polished, articulate. But Bronson didn't care about appearances. He saw integrity. He once said, Gregory Peck carried truth like it was armor. Peck wasn't just playing noble characters, he lived like one. In To Kill a Mockingbird, he became Atticus Finch, a man who stood up for justice when it wasn't popular. Bronson watched that movie privately one night and reportedly said to a friend, "That's what a real man looks like. Calm, brave, no show." It wasn't the courtroom speeches that moved him. It was the restraint. The dignity in silence. Peck's strength came from conviction, not fists. And to a man like Bronson, who had fought real battles and lived real hunger, that kind of quiet moral courage meant everything. Then came Kirk Douglas. Bronson respected Douglas not for his fame, but for his fight, not on screen, but behind it. When Hollywood blacklisted writers accused of being un-American, most stars stayed silent. Douglas didn't. He gave blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo credit for Spartacus, risking his career to do the right thing. That kind of courage, that hit Bronson deep. He once said, Kirk didn't just act strong, he was strong when it mattered, and it wasn't just politics. Douglas's work ethic was legendary. He rehearsed harder than anyone, pushed himself to exhaustion. He wasn't afraid to be unlikable either. He'd play flawed, angry, broken men and make you feel for them anyway. That honesty is what Bronson respected. He hated fake heroes. He loved men who weren't afraid to show the cracks. Then came the final name on his list, Robert Mitchum. Now, that one made perfect sense, because Mitchum was cut from the same shadow as Bronson. Rough, mysterious, untamable. Mitchum once said, "I don't act. I just show up." Bronson loved that line. He said, "That's the whole secret. You don't perform. You exist." Mitchum didn't care about fame, critics, or Hollywood politics. He could play a drifter, a criminal, a preacher, or a killer, and it all felt real. Because he wasn't pretending to be a man who'd lived through pain. He was that man. Bronson saw himself in Mitchum. Two men of few words, carved from silence, hiding emotion behind iron eyes. They weren't trained to perform. They were trained to endure. And that, in the end, was the common thread among all 7 names. Whether it was Peck's moral strength, Douglas's conviction, or Mitchum's quiet danger, Bronson saw reflections of himself. Different faces, same code. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because Bronson's list wasn't just admiration, it was a mirror. Each man he named revealed a piece of what he valued most. And if you look closely, those 7 names tell you more about Charles Bronson than any biography ever could. So what does Charles Bronson's list really mean? To some, it's just 7 names. To him, it was a creed. Look closer, and you see a pattern, not of fame, but character. Every man he respected had one thing in common: authenticity. They weren't performers. They were truth-tellers. Lee Marvin, a soldier who'd actually seen death. Steve McQueen, a rebel who fought his way out of the gutter. Clint Eastwood, a strategist who built his own empire. James Coburn, the definition of cool restraint. Gregory Peck, the moral compass. Kirk Douglas, the fighter for integrity. Robert Mitchum, the outlaw poet. Together, they form a map of Bronson's mind. He respected men who earned their silence, men who didn't fake toughness but carried it quietly, like a scar you never brag about. Because Bronson's whole life was about one thing: substance over noise. In a world full of talkers, he believed the strongest voice is the one that doesn't need to shout. That's why he never chased a celebrity. He once turned down roles that would have made him richer because he didn't believe in pretending. He didn't want to be Hollywood. He wanted to be real. People called him cold, distant, even difficult, but maybe he just didn't have time for the fake stuff. He'd been underground in the mines at 16. He'd been shot at in the war. He'd buried friends. He didn't need applause. He needed honesty. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made him timeless. Because when you watch him today, decades later, something happens. You believe him. Even when he says nothing. Especially when he says nothing. Bronson's silence was his language, his stare, his truth. His respect for these 7 men wasn't about who was popular. It was about who was real. And that's the secret he left behind. You don't have to be loud to be Stro. You just have to be real. Charles Bronson wasn't supposed to grow old. Not in people's minds, at least. He was the man who couldn't be broken. The steel-jawed Avenger, the last of the real ones. But time doesn't care who you are. In his later years, Bronson began to disappear from the screen. Not because he wanted to, but because his body was finally catching up to the life he'd lived. Decades of smoking, stunts, and physical punishment had left scars even the camera couldn't see. Rumors spread. People whispered that he'd grown reclusive, that he'd lost weight, that his memory was fading. But Bronson never confirmed anything. He didn't talk about weakness. He just faded quietly, like a cowboy riding off into a storm. When Jill Ireland, the love of his life, passed away in 1990 after a long illness, something inside him broke, permanently. Friends said he never recovered. He stopped smiling. He stopped doing interviews. The man who once commanded the screen with silence now lived in it. And yet, even in his decline, he carried that same defiance. He refused to let cameras see him vulnerable. He refused to play the part of a fading star. When he finally passed in 2003, the news hit fans like a gut punch. It wasn't just the death of an actor, it was the end of a type of man Hollywood doesn't make anymore. A man who didn't chase fame, didn't perform for the press, didn't care about the spotlight, and when the truth about his passing came out, it was darker and more human than people expected. The official report didn't say pneumonia or Alzheimer's like the tabloids claimed. It listed something more brutal: respiratory failure, lung cancer, heart disease. His body had fought too long, and finally it just gave out. In the end, Charles Bronson, the man who once survived coal mines, war, and Hollywood, lost his final battle quietly in a hospital room in Los Angeles. But here's the part people forget. He didn't want to be remembered with pity. He wanted to be remembered with respect. That's why his final resting place isn't in Hollywood. It's in Vermont, far from the cameras, surrounded by trees and silence, just the way he liked it. Because for Charles Bronson, fame was temporary, but dignity, that was forever. But before we fade to black, there's one last truth. One most people never knew. A final detail that explains why Bronson's list of respected actors mattered so much. Because it wasn't just about admiration. It was a confession. Every man leaves behind something. A legacy, a lesson, a warning. For Charles Bronson, it wasn't a speech or a book or an award. It was a list. 7 names. 7 reflections of who he was and who he wanted to be. Because deep down, Bronson wasn't talking about them. He was talking about himself. Lee Marvin, the soldier who never forgot the war. Steve McQueen, the fighter who hated to lose. Clint Eastwood, the man who built his own empire from grit and silence. James Coburn, the cool one who never needed to try. Gregory Peck, the quiet moral compass. Kirk Douglas, the relentless survivor. Robert Mitchum, the enigma who didn't care who liked him. 7 different men. 7 versions of Bronson's own spirit. He didn't respect their fame. He respected their truth. Because truth was the only thing he ever trusted. And maybe that's why he never said much in life. Because people who've seen the worst of the world, the mines, the war, the heartbreak, they don't need to talk about it. They just carry it. That's what his silence was. Not coldness, not arrogance, but weight. He once said, "The only time a man should speak is when silence won't do." And for him, silence usually did. Even now, 20 years after his death, his face still commands the screen. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Every stare, every pause, every clenched jaw, that was honesty. That was pain. That was Charles Bronson. And when you think about those 7 names he respected most, you realize something haunting. He wasn't just naming his heroes. He was revealing the 7 pieces of himself that he considered worthy of respect. So maybe that's the secret. Maybe that's the code Charles Bronson lived by. Don't fake toughness. Don't talk about honor. Just live it.
occurred at the world-renowned Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in
Legacy of films. He embodied a rare kind of authenticity, both in life and
Bronson, who had been deeply devoted to her throughout her illness, was devastated by her loss.
though he was known for his blunt and private nature. Bronson once revealed the seven
Adopted another child, reflecting their commitment to raising a large, loving household. Remained married until Bronson's death in 2003, ending their 5-year union. Charles Bronson, one of Hollywood's most enduring and iconic tough guy figures, character actor, and before long he was working steadily in television as well,
Bronson
and was seen as a model of loyalty and devotion. Tragically, their union intensity. Unlike many actors who relied on flashy dialogue or
for his relentless drive and fearlessness in portraying
Bernardo O'Reilly and The Great Escape, 1963, where actor and director. Clint was smart. He knew what the audience was, a cultural phenomenon, and though critics debated the morality of the films, played a significant role in shaping the man behind the screen legend. His first
Paul Kersey, a man driven to vigilantism after tragedy, or two characters. Finally,
Mitchum's casual, almost lazy style was not a lack of effort but a mastery.
together
Can't fake that. Bronson, often pegged as a rugged anti-hero,
serious presence he saw as the pinnacle of true screen acting.
gave him the quiet strength and intensity that became his trademark.
Where audiences admired his rugged individuality. His most iconic role,
A time when Bronson was still struggling to establish himself in Hollywood. Carried their roles like they carried their lives, honestly, directly, without apology. Cemented his reputation as a serious, capable actor.